There are stories that newspapers refuse to print, not because they lack evidence, but because the evidence itself raises questions that no one wants answered. This is one of those stories. In the autumn of 1875, a family of 5 vanished from their farmhouse in rural Virginia. The doors were locked from the inside. Their belongings remained untouched. No signs of struggle, no bodies ever found. The only clue? A basement door that had been sealed shut for decades, now standing wide open. What the neighbors found inside that basement would never be officially recorded, but the whispers spread through 3 counties like wildfire, and what people said they discovered down those stairs contradicted everything the family had claimed to be for 20 years. This is the documented account of the Harlow family and the door they should have left closed. The Harlow farmhouse sat 3 miles outside the township of Millbrook, Virginia, on a dirt road that locals called Kettle Road, for reasons no one could quite remember. Some said it was named after a peddler named Kettle, who'd frozen to death there during the harsh winter of 1803. Others claimed it came from the shape of a depression in the road that filled with water after heavy rains, forming a kettle-like pool. The truth had been lost to time, like so many truths in that part of Virginia. It was a modest 2-story structure with white clapboard siding that had grayed over the years, its paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the wood like dried skin. The house had been built in 1842 by a tobacco farmer named Elias Montgomery, who'd lost it to debt in 1854. It sat empty for nearly a year before Thomas Harlow arrived with his family in the spring of 1855.
The house was surrounded by 40 acres of tobacco fields that stretched toward a line of oak and hickory trees, marking the property's eastern boundary. To the west, the land sloped down toward Copper Creek, a narrow waterway that ran shallow most of the year but could swell to dangerous levels during spring floods. The nearest neighbors were the Porter family, whose property adjoined the Harlow's land to the north, and the Cunningham farm nearly 2 miles south down Kettle Road. Thomas Harlow, age 47 at the time of purchase, had arrived in Millbrook with a story that satisfied most people's curiosity. He'd been born in Maryland, he said, and had worked as a clerk in Baltimore before receiving an inheritance from a deceased uncle, enough money to purchase a modest farm and start a new life away from the city. His wife Margaret was from a respectable family in Richmond, though she spoke little of her past. They had 3 children, Catherine, who was 7 years old in 1855, James, who was 4, and baby Robert, barely a year old. The family kept to themselves, which wasn't unusual for farming families in that region. The post-war years would prove difficult for everyone, but even in 1855, there was a sense that Virginia was heading toward something dark and uncertain. People focused on their own survival and didn't pry too deeply into their neighbors' business. But there were aspects of the Harlow household that seemed odd from the very beginning. When Thomas purchased the property, he immediately began renovations. He hired 3 men from Millbrook to help him repair the roof and reinforce the foundation. But after 2 weeks, he dismissed them and completed the remaining work himself. One of those men, a carpenter named Henry Sutton, later told his wife that Thomas had been particularly focused on the basement. He wanted it dug deeper, Sutton recalled. Said something about needing proper storage for root vegetables and preserved goods. But the way he measured it out, the way he insisted on specific dimensions, it seemed like he was building something else, something he didn't want us to know about. Sutton also remembered that Thomas had ordered an unusual amount of lumber, far more than would be needed for simple repairs. Enough timber to build support beams for something big, he'd said. I asked him what he was planning to store down there that would need such reinforcement. He just smiled and said, "Provisions for the future, Mr. Sutton. A man must always prepare for the future." After Sutton and the other workers were dismissed, Thomas worked alone on the property for 3 months. Neighbors occasionally saw him hauling wagon loads of supplies from town: lumber, nails, chain, padlocks. Margaret and the children were rarely seen during this period. The house's windows remained shuttered even during the warm days of late summer. And then, in September of 1855, something changed. Samuel Porter, who owned the adjacent farm, was working in his fields one evening when he heard sounds coming from the Harlow property. Not the sounds of construction, but something else. Voices, multiple voices, more than could be accounted for by the Harlow family alone. He mentioned it to his wife Emma that night at supper. Sounded like Thomas might have hired some workers after all, he said, though I didn't see any wagons on the road, and I've been out in the fields all day. Emma paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. I heard singing this afternoon, she said quietly, coming from their place. It wasn't Margaret's voice. I know her voice from church. This was different, deeper, and there were multiple voices harmonizing. Samuel considered this. Maybe they've taken in some family members. Times are hard. People move in together to save on expenses. But Emma shook her head slowly. If they'd taken in family, we would have seen them at church. We would have been introduced. You know how this community works, Samuel. People don't just appear without explanation. Samuel had no response to that, and neither of them mentioned the one possibility that was already forming in both their minds, a possibility that was becoming increasingly dangerous to speak aloud as Virginia moved toward the crisis that would define the next decade. The Harlow family had brought someone to the farm, multiple someones, people who weren't being seen in public, people who were being kept out of sight. In 1855, in rural Virginia, there was only one reason to keep people hidden. The first time anyone outside the family saw the sealed basement door was in the winter of 1858, 3 years after the Harlows had settled on the property. Margaret Harlow's sister, Patricia Downing, traveled from Richmond to visit for the Christmas season. She arrived on December 18th aboard the afternoon stage, carrying a small trunk of gifts for her niece and nephews. Thomas met her at the Millbrook station with his wagon, and they made the 3-mile journey to the farmhouse in the gathering dusk. Patricia later told her husband that she'd been struck by how quiet Thomas was during the ride. He'd answered her questions about the farm and the children with brief, distracted responses. His hands on the reins were tense, his jaw tight. When she'd asked if everything was all right, he'd simply said, "We live a quiet life out here, Patricia. Sometimes the quiet can be heavy." The house, when they arrived, appeared well maintained from the outside. The fields were dormant for winter, but the barn was in good repair and smoke rose from the chimney. But as Patricia stepped down from the wagon, she noticed something that made her pause. The windows on the ground floor were covered with heavy curtains, despite the fact that it was not yet full dark. And from somewhere inside the house, she could hear a sound that didn't quite fit, a rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being moved across a floor. Margaret met her at the door with embraces and tears of joy. The children, Catherine, now 10, James, 7, and Robert, 4, were polite but subdued. They lined up to greet their aunt with careful formality, as if they'd been rehearsed. Patricia spent 3 days with the family, and those 3 days would haunt her for the rest of her life. The house itself was comfortable enough. Margaret kept it clean and orderly. Meals were simple but adequate. The children were well behaved, perhaps too well behaved. They spoke when spoken to, ate their food without complaint, and went to bed at exactly 8 each night without argument. But there were oddities that Patricia couldn't ignore. On her first evening, while Margaret was showing her the kitchen and explaining where things were kept, Patricia noticed the door. It was located along the western wall of the kitchen, a heavy oak door with black iron hinges. But the door had been sealed shut, with 8 thick planks of wood nailed across it in an X pattern. The nails were large, the kind used for heavy construction, and they'd been driven deep into the door frame with brutal efficiency. "What's down there?" Patricia asked, pointing at the sealed door. Margaret's face went pale. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous gesture Patricia had never seen her sister make before. "Storage," she said. "Just a root cellar, but it's not suitable. Structural problems. Thomas sealed it shut for safety." "Couldn't he repair it? Surely a root cellar would be useful." "We manage without it." Margaret's voice had gone flat. "Don't ask about it again, Patricia, please." The tone of that final word, "please," carried such desperate weight that Patricia dropped the subject immediately. but she found herself staring at that sealed door throughout her visit, wondering what could possibly require such extreme measures. On her second night, Patricia woke at 2 in the morning to use the chamber pot. As she sat in the darkness of the guest room, she heard sounds from below. The house was old, and sounds traveled easily through the floors. At first, she thought it was just the normal creaking of the structure settling in the cold. But then she heard voices, not from the Harlow family's bedrooms above. These voices came from below, from beneath the house, from the direction of the sealed door. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear the cadence of conversation. A man's voice, low and steady, and then others responding. At least 2 different voices, possibly more. There was a musical quality to some of it, like humming or chanting. Patricia sat frozen in the darkness, her heart pounding. She thought about going downstairs, about investigating, but something stopped her. Some instinct told her that whatever was happening below the house, it was something she didn't want to know about, something dangerous to witness. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room, heavy, masculine footsteps. Thomas walking toward the stairs. She heard him descend, heard the faint sound of wood scraping against wood, heard a door open and close. The voices below became briefly louder, more distinct, and then were muffled again as the door closed. Patricia didn't sleep for the rest of that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. Once she thought she heard crying, a woman's voice sobbing quietly, but it might have been the wind. She told herself it was the wind. On her third morning, Patricia was helping Margaret prepare breakfast when she noticed something on the kitchen floor near the sealed door. Dark stains in the wood. Old stains, worn by repeated scrubbing, but still visible if you knew where to look. "Margaret," she said quietly, "what happened here?" Her sister didn't look up from the eggs she was frying. "Accidents happen on farms, Patricia. You know that." "What kind of accidents?" "The kind we don't discuss." That afternoon, Patricia was sitting in the parlor with Catherine, teaching her a new embroidery stitch, when the young girl suddenly said, "Aunt Patricia, do you ever hear voices that aren't really there?" Patricia's needle stopped mid-stitch. "What do you mean, dear?" Catherine kept her eyes on her work. "Sometimes I hear people talking, but when I look, there's no one there. Mama says it's my imagination. She says I'm making up stories." "Where do you hear these voices?" "At night, mostly. Coming from the kitchen, from the place we're not supposed to talk about." Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes I dream that the door opens and people come out, people I've never seen before. They look at me, and they look sad, so sad. And in my dreams they ask me to help them, but I don't know how." Margaret appeared in the doorway so suddenly that Patricia jumped.
"Catherine, go upstairs and check on your brothers." The girl stood immediately, setting aside her embroidery without a word of protest. She left the room with her head down, not meeting her mother's eyes. When Catherine was gone, Margaret sat down heavily in the chair her daughter had vacated. She looked at Patricia with an expression of such profound exhaustion that it seemed to age her 10 years. "You can't say anything," Margaret said. "Do you understand? You can't tell anyone what you've heard or seen here." "Margaret, what's going on? What's behind that door?" "I can't tell you, and you don't want to know. Trust me, Patricia, you don't want to know. Just go home tomorrow as planned. Go back to Richmond, live your life, and try to forget you were ever here." "How can I forget? How can I leave you here with whatever this is?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Because there's no alternative. Because what's done is done. Because if the truth came out, it wouldn't save anyone. It would only destroy what's left of us. The children, Patricia. Think of the children. They're innocent in this." Patricia wanted to press further, wanted to demand answers, but the look of broken desperation on her sister's face stopped her. She reached across and took Margaret's hand, finding it ice cold despite the warmth of the room. "Are you safe?" Patricia asked. "Are the children safe?" "As safe as we can be," Margaret replied, "as safe as anyone is in this world. But Patricia, promise me something. promise me that if something happens to us, if we disappear, you'll tell someone. Tell the authorities. Make sure someone knows to look in the basement." "Why would you disappear?" Margaret didn't answer. She just squeezed Patricia's hand once, hard, and then stood and left the room. Patricia departed the next morning. Thomas drove her back to the Millbrook station in silence. As she was boarding the stage, she turned back to him and said, "Thomas, whatever you're doing out there, it's not worth it. Nothing is worth what I see in my sister's eyes." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right, Patricia. It's not worth it, but it's too late to stop now. Some roads only go forward. You can't turn back even when you realize you've taken the wrong path." Those were the last words Patricia Downing ever heard from her brother-in-law. She wrote to Margaret regularly over the following years, but her letters often went unanswered. The few responses she received were brief and carefully worded, saying nothing of substance. Patricia never visited the farmhouse again, but she kept her sister's request in mind. If anything happened to the Harlows, she would tell someone to look in the basement. In 1875, when news of the family's disappearance finally reached her in Richmond, Patricia was 63 years old and suffering from a wasting illness that would kill her within the year. She was too weak to travel to Millbrook herself, but she wrote a detailed letter to the county sheriff describing everything she'd seen and heard during her visit 17 years earlier. That letter arrived 3 days after Sheriff Curtis had already discovered the basement and its secrets. But Patricia's testimony confirmed something critical. Whatever had been happening in the Harlow basement had been going on since at least 1855, possibly from the beginning of the family's residence on Kettle Road. 20 years of horror hidden behind 8 planks of nailed oak. 20 years of people living beneath the feet of a seemingly ordinary family. 20 years of sounds that should have prompted questions but didn't, because in Virginia in those years there were many things people chose not to see. The 15 years between the Harlows' arrival and the beginning of the 1870s passed with deceptive normalcy for anyone observing from outside. Thomas worked his 40 acres of tobacco with dogged determination. Margaret maintained the household. The children grew from youth into adolescence. But underneath that veneer of normalcy, a dark routine had established itself, a pattern of life that the Harlow family maintained with careful precision. The farming pattern. Samuel Porter, the neighboring farmer, noticed early on that Thomas Harlow's approach to agriculture was unusual. Most tobacco farmers in the region hired seasonal help during planting and harvest. The work was too intensive for one man to manage alone. But Thomas never hired anyone after that initial construction period in 1855. Instead, he worked with supernatural intensity. Samuel would see him in the fields before dawn, already bent over the tobacco rows, and he'd still be there as darkness fell. The man seemed to require no rest, no breaks, no assistance. "Saw Thomas out in his fields yesterday during that rainstorm," Samuel mentioned to his wife in June of 1860. "Most of us had sense enough to come inside. Not him. He was out there in the pouring rain harvesting tobacco like the devil himself was chasing him." But Emma had noticed something else. "Have you ever watched him work closely, Samuel? I mean, really watched?" "Can't say that I have." "Why?" "Because I have. Last week, when I was hanging laundry, I could see into his far field, and Samuel, he wasn't alone." Samuel sat down his coffee cup carefully. "What do you mean?" "There were others with him, working the rows. I counted at least 4, maybe 5 different people, but they weren't hired workers from town. I'd have recognized them. These were people I've never seen before, and they moved strangely, slowly, like they were exhausted or ill. Thomas was walking up and down the rows, watching them work. Maybe he brought in workers from another county. Then where are their wagons? Where do they stay? I've never seen anyone come or go from that property except the family. But there were people in those fields, Samuel. I'm sure of it." Samuel didn't know what to say.
He and Emma had developed an unspoken agreement not to speculate too deeply about the Harlow farm, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The Harlow property produced modest but consistent yields of tobacco each year, not enough to suggest prosperity, but enough to keep the family fed and the property taxes paid. Thomas sold his crop at the Millbrook market like everyone else, exchanging pleasantries with other farmers, conducting his business with efficient courtesy. But merchants in town noticed oddities about his purchasing habits. William Gardner, who ran the general store, kept detailed ledgers of his customers' purchases. Years later, when authorities examined those ledgers as part of their investigation, certain patterns became clear. Thomas Harlow purchased far more food than a family of 5 should need. Not luxury items, his purchases were basic staples: flour, cornmeal, salted pork, dried beans, but the quantities were excessive. In an average month, he bought enough provisions to feed twice as many people as lived in his household. He also purchased medical supplies in unusual amounts: bandages, carbolic acid for disinfection, laudanum for pain, chloroform, needles and surgical thread. When Gardner once commented on the quantity of medical supplies, Thomas explained that he was interested in medical self-sufficiency. "Can't always get to a doctor when you need one out on the farm," Thomas had said. "Man should know how to tend to his own injuries." Gardner found this reasonable enough, but then he noticed Thomas purchasing medical textbooks, advanced surgical manuals, anatomy references, texts on the emerging field of neurology. These weren't books about treating common farm injuries. These were serious medical volumes, the kind used by trained physicians. "Thinking of becoming a doctor?" Gardner had joked. Thomas didn't smile. "Just trying to understand how the body works, Mr. Gardner. Knowledge is never wasted."
There were other purchases that seemed innocuous individually, but created a disturbing pattern when viewed collectively. Chain and padlocks, oil lamps and lamp oil in large quantities, fabric and clothing in a range of sizes, including adult sizes that wouldn't fit any members of the Harlow family, paper and ink, far more than would be needed for normal correspondence. Thomas was documenting something, and he was providing for people who weren't supposed to exist. The church visits. The Harlow family attended the Millbrook Methodist Church irregularly, perhaps once every 6 to 8 weeks. Their attendance was unpredictable enough that Reverend Walsh couldn't count on them for any regular church functions, but frequent enough that they maintained a nominal presence in the community. When they did attend, they always arrived late and sat in the back pew. Margaret would keep the children close, her hands resting on their shoulders with what seemed like excessive firmness. Thomas would stare straight ahead during the sermons, his expression unreadable. They never stayed for the social hour after services, never participated in church picnics or fundraisers, never invited other families to their home or accepted invitations to others' homes. Reverend Walsh tried several times to make pastoral visits to the Harlow farm. Each time he was met at the door by Thomas, who would step outside to speak with him rather than inviting him in. "Just wanted to see how your family is faring, Mr. Harlow. We haven't seen you at services in some weeks." "We're managing fine, Reverend. The farm keeps us busy, of course. But you know the church community is here to support one another. If your family needs anything—" "We need nothing. Thank you. We're self-sufficient." The conversations always ended the same way, with Thomas politely but firmly dismissing the Reverend and closing the door. Walsh later told the church deacons that he'd never once been allowed inside the Harlow house, despite making at least a dozen attempts over the years. But there was one service that stood out in Walsh's memory. It was Easter Sunday, 1868. The church was full. Even irregular attendees made an effort for Easter. The Harlow family arrived and took their usual position in the back pew. During the sermon, Walsh spoke about resurrection and redemption, about the possibility of salvation, even for those who had sinned greatly. It was a standard Easter message, one he'd delivered many times before. But as he spoke, he noticed Margaret Harlow beginning to cry, not quiet tears.
She was sobbing openly, her shoulders shaking. Her daughter, Catherine, now 20 years old, put an arm around her mother and whispered urgently in her ear. Thomas sat motionless, staring at Walsh with an intensity that made the Reverend falter in his delivery. There was something in that stare, not hostility, but something worse, desperation, like a man drowning who knows no one can save him. The family left before the service ended. Walsh saw them walk rapidly to their wagon and drive at a speed that seemed almost frantic. He never saw Margaret Harlow at church again. For the next 7 years, until the family's disappearance, only Thomas and the children occasionally attended services. When asked about his wife, Thomas would simply say she was feeling poorly and couldn't make the journey. The children, the Harlow children, Catherine, James, and Robert, were by all accounts polite, well-educated, and deeply strange. Margaret taught them at home rather than sending them to the small school in Millbrook. This wasn't unusual. Many farm families educated their children at home, but the Harlow children had almost no social interaction with other young people their age. Catherine, the eldest, was occasionally seen in town when she accompanied her father to the market. She was a quiet girl who grew into a quiet young woman, pretty in an unremarkable way, with her mother's dark hair and her father's sharp features. She would stand beside the wagon while Thomas conducted business, her eyes always downcast, her hands clasped in front of her. Louise Gardner, the merchant's daughter, once tried to befriend Catherine at the market. Louise was the same age, eager for female companionship in a town where young women were few. "Hello, you're Catherine Harlow, aren't you? We're the same age. I was thinking perhaps we could—" "I'm sorry," Catherine interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not allowed to make friends." "Not allowed? But surely—" "Please don't talk to me. You'll only make things worse." And Catherine had turned away, leaving Louise standing confused and a little hurt in the middle of the market square. But later that day, as Louise was helping her father close up the store, she saw Catherine standing across the street, partially hidden by a building corner. The girl was staring at Louise with an expression of such profound longing and sadness that it made Louise's heart ache. Then Thomas appeared, took Catherine by the arm, not roughly but firmly, and led her back toward their wagon. Catherine went without resistance, her head bowed, looking like someone being led to execution. James and Robert were even more isolated. They were rarely seen in town at all. The few times they appeared with their father, they were silent and watchful, their eyes darting around as if everything they saw was strange and new. A traveling school teacher visited Millbrook in 1869 and offered to test any children whose parents wanted to assess their education. Thomas brought James and Robert, then 18 and 14 respectively, for evaluation. The teacher, a woman named Miss Constance Winters, later wrote in her journal about the encounter. The Harlow boys are extraordinarily well educated in academic subjects. James demonstrated proficiency in mathematics, literature, and even basic Latin. Robert, though younger, showed similar aptitude. But there was something deeply unsettling about them. They answered questions mechanically, as if they'd been drilled on responses. They never initiated conversation. When I asked them about their interests, their hobbies, what they enjoyed doing, they looked at each other in confusion, as if the question made no sense. James finally said, "We work, Miss Winters. We study and we work. That's what we do." I asked what kind of work they did on the farm. Robert started to answer, then stopped abruptly and looked at his brother. James said quickly, "Field work, taking care of the animals, regular farm duties." But there was something in the way he said it that felt rehearsed. And Robert had gone very pale, his eyes wide, like he'd almost revealed something dangerous. I asked if they ever played games or went fishing in the creek, or did any of the things young men typically enjoy. They both stared at me blankly. "We don't have time for such things," James finally said. "There's too much work to do. Always too much work." Their father was waiting outside the evaluation. When I emerged to give him my assessment, I mentioned that while his sons were academically advanced, they seemed to lack normal social development. They needed more interaction with other young people, more time for recreation. Mr. Harlow's jaw tightened. They're being prepared for the realities of life, Miss Winters. The world isn't kind. They need to understand duty and discipline. I suggested that children also need joy and friendship. He simply looked at me with cold eyes and said, "Those are luxuries we can't afford." As they were leaving, young Robert turned back to look at me. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, but James grabbed his arm and pulled him along. The last thing I saw was Thomas placing his hands on both boys' shoulders, not affectionately, but like a jailer securing prisoners and guiding them toward their wagon. I felt deeply disturbed by the encounter, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. There was something terribly wrong in that family, something that went beyond mere strictness or social awkwardness. Those children lived in a prison, I'm certain of it, but the bars of their prison were invisible to everyone except them. Miss Winters left Millbrook the following week and never returned, but she kept that journal entry, and it would later become part of the official investigation file. The sounds at night. The Porter family, living closest to the Harlows, developed an unspoken policy of never discussing what they heard at night. But Emma Porter kept a private diary, and in it she recorded observations that would later prove crucial to understanding the timeline of events. August 12, 1862. Heard singing again tonight from the Harlow property. It's beautiful in a way that breaks my heart. Sounds like the old spirituals that the enslaved people used to sing before the war. But I haven't seen any colored folks working on Thomas's farm. Where is that singing coming from? October 3, 1864. The war is everywhere now. Men from Millbrook have been conscripted. We're all afraid. But the Harlow farm remains strangely untouched.
Thomas received no conscription notice. I wonder why. Samuel says it's because he's over 40 and has 3 children to support. But I think there's another reason. I think the authorities know something about that farm, something that makes them want to stay away. January 17, 1866. The war is over and everything is changed. The enslaved people are free now, legally free. But I heard crying coming from the Harlow property last night. A woman's voice crying out words I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like begging. Samuel told me to close the window and go to sleep. He said, "Some things aren't our business." But how can human suffering not be our business? March 22, 1868. Saw something tonight that I can't explain. I was up with a toothache, looking out the window to distract myself from the pain. It was well past midnight, and I saw lights moving around the Harlow property. Lantern lights, at least 3 or 4 of them. They were moving through the fields in a strange pattern, like people searching for something, or perhaps burying something. The lights were out there for more than an hour. In the morning, I looked across at their south field and saw fresh, disturbed earth. Someone had been digging. June 8, 1870. The sounds from the Harlow place are different now. Less singing, more, I don't know how to describe it. Moaning, perhaps, or keening, like the sound of animals in pain. Margaret Harlow hasn't been to church in 2 years. The children look haunted. Thomas looks like a man carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. I don't know what's happening on that farm, but I know it's evil. I know it in my bones. But what can I do? Who would believe me? And what proof do I have beyond sounds in the night and my own intuition? Emma's final entry about the Harlows was dated September 25, 1875, just 10 days before the family's disappearance. Something is coming to an end. I can feel it. There's a change in the air around the Harlow property, like the pressure before a storm. Thomas looks worse each time I see him, gaunt, hollow-eyed, jumping at shadows. The children move like they're sleepwalking through their lives. And last night, I heard the most disturbing sound yet. It wasn't singing or crying. It was laughter, cold, mirthless laughter, coming from somewhere beneath the ground, and then a voice. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, shouting words I could just barely make out. Soon, soon, soon. God help us all. To understand what happened in that basement, we must first understand who lived there. This has been the most difficult aspect of the case to reconstruct, because Thomas Harlow and his associates took great pains to ensure these 7 people would leave no official trace. But through pieced-together documents, coded letters, bills of sale, and later testimony, we can reconstruct at least partial identities. Samuel, age 27 in 1854, though his real age may have been different. According to one fragmented document found in the basement, Samuel had been born on a tobacco plantation in North Carolina. He'd worked in the field since age 7. He was described in a bill of sale as strong, healthy, literate, skilled in carpentry and animal husbandry. The fact that Samuel was literate was significant. It meant he'd been taught to read despite laws prohibiting education of enslaved people. This suggested intelligence and determination that Thomas Harlow must have found either promising or threatening. Samuel's handwriting appeared on wooden beams in the basement, scratched in with what must have been a nail or piece of metal. Dates, names, and simple messages like, "Remember who you are, and they cannot take your soul." Ruth, age approximately 23 in 1854. Documents suggested she'd been a house servant on a Virginia plantation, skilled in cooking, cleaning, and child care. What the bill of sale didn't mention was that Ruth was anything but docile. According to Thomas's journals, she was the first to resist his procedures, fighting him so violently during the initial examination that he had to physically restrain her. Her spirit, it seemed, was unbreakable, at least initially. Scratched into the wall near one of the sleeping pallets was what appeared to be poetry in Ruth's handwriting, judging by the style and content. They can chain the body, but not the mind. They can take freedom, but not dignity. They can steal years, but not spirit. We are more than what they make us. We remain. Marcus, age approximately 22, was listed in fragmentary records as a blacksmith's apprentice. He'd been trained in metalwork, which meant he had valuable skills beyond field labor. The bill of sale described him as intelligent, skilled in ironwork and metalwork, can read and write, requires firm management. That last phrase, requires firm management, was code that suggested Marcus had a history of resistance or attempted escape. He would not submit easily. Ironically, Marcus's metalworking skills may have been what allowed the eventual escape. Tool marks found in the basement suggested that someone with knowledge of metal had modified the chains over time, weakening them at key points in ways that wouldn't be immediately visible. Rebecca, age 19 in 1854, was described in documents as coming from a breeding farm in southern Virginia, one of the most horrible institutions of the slavery system, where women were forced to have children to be sold as property. The fact that Rebecca was described as young, healthy, childbearing age, suitable for domestic or field work tells us everything about the horror of her early life. But Rebecca survived. More than survived, she retained a core of herself that even Thomas Harlow's procedures couldn't fully erase. Her name appeared more than any other in his journals, usually with notes of frustration, Subject 4 showing unexpected memory retention, and Subject 4 showing unexpected memory retention. Joshua, also age 19 in 1854, had been trained as a carpenter. The bill of sale described him as skilled in woodworking and construction, literate, good with calculations, suitable for skilled labor positions. Joshua's carpentry skills would prove crucial to the eventual escape. The tunnel that was discovered after the disappearance showed signs of sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. The walls were properly shored up with wooden supports, preventing collapse even as it extended 30 feet through clay soil. Dinah, age 18 in 1854, was listed as field worker from a South Carolina rice plantation. She was described as strong, enduring, experienced in agricultural work,
able to work long hours in difficult conditions. What the bill of sale didn't mention was that Dinah apparently had medical knowledge, folk medicine passed down through generations. Thomas's journals occasionally referenced Subject 6 attempting to create medicinal compounds from plants she somehow acquired. How she acquired plants while imprisoned underground remained a mystery, but it suggested resourcefulness and determination. Benjamin, age 18 in 1854, was listed only as suitable for general labor.
Unlike the others, there were no special skills attributed to him in the sale documents. But that didn't mean he lacked capabilities. It meant he'd been careful to hide them from his enslavers. Benjamin appeared to be the one who wrote most prolifically on the basement walls: poetry, prayers, calculations, calendars. He covered every available surface with writing, as if determined to leave a record that couldn't be erased. One message, written in neat, careful letters near the ceiling of the second chamber, where it would be hard to see, read, "We were 7. We were human. We had names. Remember us: Samuel, Ruth, Marcus, Rebecca, Joshua, Dinah, Benjamin. We existed. We mattered. We will not be forgotten." These 7 people snatched from their already horrible circumstances and sold to Thomas Harlow with the understanding that they would completely disappear, were brought to the farmhouse on Kettle Road in the summer of 1855. They entered that basement as human beings with names, histories, skills, and dreams. Thomas Harlow intended to remake them into something else entirely. The medical journals found in the basement provided a detailed and deeply disturbing account of what Thomas Harlow did to the 7 captives imprisoned there. These documents, which Sheriff Curtis later sealed from public view, represent one of the most horrifying chapters in American medical history. Thomas Harlow had served during the Mexican-American War as an assistant to an army surgeon named Dr. Devin Barrett. During this service, he'd witnessed numerous head injuries and their effects. He'd seen men take bullets to the skull and survive with personality changes. He'd seen men with traumatic brain injuries who lost memories, changed behavior patterns, even seemed to become different people. This experience led him to a hypothesis that was both scientifically intriguing and morally monstrous. If damage to specific brain regions could change personality and behavior, could careful surgical intervention create controlled changes? Could you, through precise manipulation of brain tissue, alter someone's sense of self? In the 1840s and 1850s, this was not as far-fetched as it might sound. The emerging field of neurology was just beginning to map brain function. Phineas Gage's famous case, in which an iron rod through his skull dramatically changed his personality, had occurred in 1848 and was widely discussed in medical circles. Doctors were beginning to understand that different brain regions controlled different functions. But there was a vast ethical distance between observing these effects in accident victims and deliberately inducing them through experimental surgery. Thomas Harlow crossed that distance without apparent hesitation. His journals began in August 1855. August 18, 1855. Initial examinations completed on all 7 subjects. They are in good physical health overall, though show signs of previous malnutrition and injury consistent with their backgrounds. Have explained to them that they will be participants in medical procedures that may help countless people in the future. They do not appear enthusiastic, but their cooperation is not required for the advancement of science. The basement laboratory is complete. Have all necessary instruments purchased through DB in Baltimore, who has access to medical suppliers who ask no questions. Chloroform and laudanum acquired in sufficient quantities for multiple procedures. Surgical texts provide adequate guidance for the planned interventions. M is disturbed by the project. She understands the necessity intellectually, but lacks the detachment required for scientific inquiry.
The children are kept separate from the basement areas and have been instructed never to speak of what they may hear. Catherine is old enough to ask questions, but she's a compliant child. She will keep secrets. Tomorrow I begin with Subject 1, Samuel. He has the strongest personality of the group, which makes him ideal for the first trial. If the procedure works on him, it will work on anyone. August 22, 1855. First procedure completed. Subject 1 sedated with chloroform until completely unconscious. Made incision at base of skull, approximately 2 inches above the neck, 3 inches in length. Drew back the skin and muscle tissue to expose the skull. Used a trephine drill purchased from medical supplier in Baltimore to create a small opening in the skull, approximately 1 inch in diameter, centered at the cranial base. Extreme care taken to avoid damaging major blood vessels. Through this opening inserted a thin silver wire, approximately 2 inches into the brain tissue, angling toward what anatomical texts indicate is the region responsible for higher executive function and personality integration. The hypothesis, disrupting the connections in this region, will make the subject more suggestible and less capable of independent decision-making. Wire left in place, secured with surgical thread to surrounding tissue. Skull opening left open for now, may need to access again if initial results are unsatisfactory. Skin and muscles sutured closed over the site, bandages applied. Subject began regaining consciousness approximately 6 hours post-procedure. Initial signs are promising. He appears confused, compliant, significant memory disruption. He does not resist verbal commands. August 25, 1855. Subject 1 showing concerning signs. He has difficulty walking without assistance. His speech is slurred and confused. He appears to have lost the ability to feed himself. This level of cognitive impairment is beyond what was intended. May have damaged more extensive brain structures than planned. Subject frequently asks, "Where am I and what happened?" but does not seem to register the answers, even when repeated. His eyes follow movement, but show no recognition or comprehension. September 15, 1855. Subject 1's expired this morning. The body has been interred in the Southfield after dark as planned. M refused to help with the burial, despite my explanation that Subject 1's sacrifice will ultimately benefit humanity. She locked herself in our bedroom and would not speak to me for the remainder of the day. I understand her distress is rooted in emotion, not logic. She cannot see beyond the individual to the greater purpose. This is a feminine weakness I must learn to tolerate. Subject 1's death, while regrettable, has provided valuable information. I now understand the limits of intervention in that particular brain region. The next procedure will be modified accordingly. The journals continued in this vein for pages. Thomas Harlow systematically performed procedures on each of the 7 captives, refining his technique with each attempt. He kept detailed notes on insertion angles, depths, locations. He documented recovery times, behavioral changes, and complications. Ruth, Subject 2, survived her procedure, but suffered severe cognitive damage. Thomas's notes indicated she regressed to what he called a childlike state. Unable to form new memories, with significantly impaired reasoning ability, but physically functional and able to follow simple commands. For 12 years, Ruth lived in the basement in this diminished state. Thomas's journals recorded that she would sometimes sing songs she'd known before the procedure, suggesting that deeper memory structures remained intact even as her higher functions were destroyed. She died of pneumonia in 1867.
Subject 2 served adequately as a household assistant in her limited capacity, Thomas wrote. Her compliant nature post-procedure validated the core hypothesis. Marcus,
Subject 3 was deemed the success story. Thomas's journal entries about him became almost enthusiastic. Subject 3 has recovered with minimal visible deficits. He can perform complex tasks when instructed. He shows no aggressive behavior, no resistance to commands. Most remarkably, he appears to have no memory of his life before the procedure. When asked, he cannot recall where he was born, whether he has family, or any details of his personal history. He exists in an eternal present, performing tasks I assign without question or complaint. This is the outcome I have theorized. This proves the concept. Marcus lived in the basement for 15 years, serving as what Thomas called an ideal subject. He died in his sleep in 1870, aged approximately 38. Thomas seemed genuinely sad about this loss. Subject 3's unexpected passing is a significant setback. He had become reliably useful. We'll need to rely more heavily on the remaining subjects. The others, Rebecca, Joshua, Dina, and Benjamin, underwent multiple procedures as Thomas attempted to replicate his success with Marcus, but he was never able to achieve the same results. Some suffered terrible complications and died within months. Others survived, but retained more cognitive function than intended. And crucially, the three who ultimately survived longest, Rebecca, Joshua, and Dina, showed something Thomas had not anticipated: recovery. March 3, 1872. Disturbing development with Subject 4, Rebecca. She has begun asking questions about her past, questions that indicate returning memory. This should not be possible. The neural disruption was permanent, yet she appears to be reconstructing memories, building new neural pathways around the damaged regions. The human brain is more adaptable than the medical literature suggests. This is fascinating from a scientific standpoint, but problematic from a practical one. July 19, 1873. Subjects 4, 5, and 6, Rebecca, Joshua, Dina, have definitely regained significant cognitive function. They communicate with each other when they believe I'm not listening. They begun refusing certain tasks, claiming fatigue or illness. Subject 4, yesterday, looked directly at me and said, "I remember what you did to us." Her eyes were clear, focused, filled with what I can only describe as controlled hatred. I'm considering whether additional intervention is necessary, but I am hesitant to risk further procedures that might prove fatal. These three subjects represent years of work. November 2, 1874. The situation grows increasingly untenable. The remaining subjects have somehow removed their restraints. I found the chains cut through with what appears to be a metal file. How they acquired such a tool is a mystery. They remain in the basement, but are no longer truly contained. They could force their way through the sealed door if they chose to. I believe they are planning something. M is terrified. She wants me to release them, but I cannot. They know too much. They would expose everything. The children would be implicated. Our family would be destroyed. There is no good choice remaining. There are only degrees of catastrophe. April 17, 1875. Found evidence today that the remaining subjects have been digging. There is a hole in the corner of the main chamber, concealed behind one of the sleeping pallets. It extends several feet into the earth. They are attempting to tunnel out. I should stop them, seal the hole, reinforce the basement, but I find myself lacking the will. A part of me, a part I did not know still existed, wants them to succeed, wants this nightmare to end. 20 years is long enough. God forgive me. 20 years is far too long. The final entry about the procedures was dated September 28, 1875. The last entry in Thomas's journal. They are free in every way that matters. The surgical interventions have reversed themselves through some mechanism I don't understand. Rebecca, Joshua, and Dina are fully themselves again, whoever they were before I destroyed them. They remember everything, their lives before I bought them, their time in the basement, every procedure, every indignity, every moment of 20 years in darkness. And they are planning something. I can see it in their eyes when I bring food down to them. They look at me the way a hunter looks at prey. They've stopped eating the food I provide. I think they fear poison, though I've never considered such a direct solution. They've been singing at night, old songs, spirituals about freedom and deliverance and judgment. M begs me to go to the authorities, to confess, to end this before something terrible happens, but I cannot. Confession would mean imprisonment, execution, the destruction of my children's futures. Catherine, James, Robert, they would bear the stigma of their father's crimes for the rest of their lives. There is no good choice remaining. There are only degrees of catastrophe. I find myself thinking, perhaps I deserve whatever they're planning. Perhaps we all do. M for her silent complicity, the children for their willful ignorance, myself for my monstrous curiosity. Perhaps the only justice in this situation is the justice they will create. I hear them digging every night now. The tunnel is deep, extensive. Soon they will reach the surface. And then the entry ended there, mid-sentence, as if Thomas had been interrupted or simply lost the will to continue writing. 7 days later, someone would slip an anonymous letter under the door of the Millbrook Methodist Church, warning that someone should look in the Harlow basement before it was too late. And 5 days after that, Reverend Walsh would knock on the farmhouse door and receive no answer. The official investigation into the disappearance of the Harlow family began on the evening of October 5, 1875, and would ultimately involve Sheriff William Curtis, 4 deputized men, Reverend Marcus Walsh, 2 church deacons, and eventually a special investigator sent from the Virginia State Attorney's Office. What they found would challenge their understanding of human capacity for both evil and endurance. Evening of October 5, 1875. Initial discovery. Sheriff Curtis arrived at the farmhouse just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the tobacco fields. The house appeared normal from the outside, well-maintained, quiet, giving no indication of the horrors it contained. The front door was locked, so was the back door. All ground-floor windows were latched from the inside. It was Peter Griffith, the youngest deputy, who discovered that one window at the rear of the house, a small window that opened into what appeared to be a pantry, had been left unlatched. "Sheriff," Griffith called out, "I can get through here." Curtis nodded. "Be careful. Call out if you see anything unusual." Griffith climbed through the window, his movements careful in the gathering dark. They heard him moving around inside, the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floors. Then silence. "Griffith?" Curtis called. "What do you see?" No answer. "Griffith!" Finally, the deputy's voice came from inside, shaky and strange. "Sheriff, you need to see this right now. You need to see this."
From inside, the house was dim. No lamps had been lit, but enough twilight came through the windows to see clearly. Everything was in perfect order. The parlor furniture was neatly arranged. The stairs leading to the second floor showed no signs of disturbance. In the bedrooms upstairs, beds were made with careful precision. Clothes were folded and put away. Personal items, hairbrushes, books, a child's toy wooden horse, sat in their proper places. It looked like a house whose occupants had simply stepped out and would return at any moment. But in the kitchen, the illusion of normalcy shattered. The table was set for five plates, 5 cups, 5 sets of silverware, and on each plate sat food, or what had been food several days earlier. Roasted chicken, now rotting, potatoes now covered in mold, bread hard and curling, vegetables decomposing into a foul-smelling mess. The flies had found the meal. They buzzed lazily in the dim light, fat and satisfied. They sat down to eat, Reverend Walsh said quietly. And then what? They just left the table in the middle of dinner? But Sheriff Curtis was looking past the table, past the rotting food, to the far wall of the kitchen. The door was open. The heavy oak door that had been sealed with 8 planks of wood for 20 years was standing open, revealing darkness beyond. The boards that had sealed it lay scattered across the floor, nails still embedded in the wood. Some appeared to have been pried off, others looked like they'd been cut through with a saw. And on the floor, in the space between the table and the open door, were footprints, multiple sets of footprints, tracked in something dark that had dried to a rust-brown color. The prints overlapped and confused each other, creating a chaotic pattern, but the general direction was clear: up from the basement, around the kitchen, and then back down into the basement. Deputy Edgar Thompson knelt beside the prints, studying them carefully. He'd served in the war, had seen battlefields, knew what dried blood looked like. This wasn't blood, it was mud. Clay mud from deep earth mixed with something else, something organic. How many people? Curtis asked. Thompson studied the prints carefully. At least 8 different sets, possibly more. Different sizes, some large, some small. Some appear to have been made by bare feet, others by shoes or boots. 8 people, but there were only 5 in the family. I know, Sheriff. I'm just telling you what I see. Curtis took a lantern from the wall hook, lit it with a match from his pocket, and approached the open door. A set of steep stairs descended into darkness. The smell coming up from below was overwhelming. Damp earth, mold, human waste, and something else, something medical, antiseptic mixed with decay. "Thomas Harlow," Curtis called down the stairs. "This is Sheriff William Curtis. If you're down there, I need you to come up right now." His voice echoed in the space below. No response came back. "Mr. Harlow, I'm coming down. If you're armed, put your weapon down. I don't want anyone getting hurt." Still no response. Curtis began his descent, holding the lantern high. The wooden steps creaked under his weight. The walls on either side were carved from clay soil, shored up with timber beams. The construction was crude but functional, the work of someone who knew basic engineering, but had done the work himself without professional help. The stairs went down about 12 feet before opening to the first chamber. What Curtis saw at the bottom of those stairs made him stop moving, made him forget for a moment how to breathe. "My God," he whispered. Behind him, Peter Griffith had followed despite not being asked to. The young deputy looked over Curtis's shoulder and immediately vomited against the wall. The basement, if you could call it that, extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. The first chamber was roughly 15 feet square, with packed earth floors and walls of exposed clay. Timber beams, carefully placed and anchored, held up the ceiling and prevented collapse. But it was what occupied this space that made grown men recoil. 7 sleeping pallets arranged in 2 rows. Not beds, these were barely more than piles of straw covered with thin, stained blankets. Each pallet had a small wooden box beside it, containing a few items: a tin cup, a wooden spoon, a scrap of cloth that might have once been clothing. The pallets showed clear signs of long-term use. The straw was compressed and old. The blankets were worn through in places, mended with crude stitching. One box contained a comb made from bone, carved by hand, judging from the irregular teeth. But what made Curtis's blood run cold was the evidence of imprisonment.
Iron rings were bolted into the support beams at intervals, 7 rings, positioned exactly where someone lying on each pallet would be within reach. Attached to some of these rings were remnants of chain, cut through with what looked like a file or saw, but clearly having once served to restrain whoever slept on the pallets. The walls bore marks that could only be made by human hands, scratches in the clay, worn smooth with repeated tracing, and writing carved into the hard earth with extraordinary patience, the letters deep and clear. Day 1875. 20 years we endure. Remember who you are. They cannot take what matters. We were 7. An entire wall section was covered in what appeared to be a calendar, scratches grouped in sets of 5, crossed through to make weeks, then months, then years. Someone had been counting days, all the days, every single day for 2 decades. In the corner stood a bucket that had served as a privy. Despite having been unused for at least several days, the smell was overwhelming. There was no dignity here, no privacy. This was a place where human beings had been reduced to animals. But humans are not animals, and the evidence of their humanity was everywhere. Poems scratched into the walls, prayers, simple drawings, a bird, a tree, a house, symbols of a world above that the people imprisoned here could barely remember. Mathematical calculations, as if someone had been keeping their mind active through abstract problems. Musical notation. Someone had composed songs in this darkness. Sheriff Curtis forced himself to move deeper into the chamber. At the far end, a narrow opening led to a second room. He had to duck to pass through it. If the first chamber was a prison, the second chamber was something worse. It was a place where Thomas Harlow had played God and failed miserably. The room was smaller, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet. Along one wall stood a wooden table, and on that table lay instruments that Sheriff Curtis recognized from his own brief experience with military medicine during the war. Surgical tools, scalpels of various sizes, their blades showing signs of repeated sharpening, forceps, clamps, bone saws, a trephine drill used for boring holes in skulls with dried matter still adhering to the bit, surgical thread and needles, bottles containing clear liquids labeled in Thomas's neat handwriting, chloroform, laudanum, carbolic acid, and blood. Dried blood on the instruments, on the table, in dark stains that had soaked into the wooden surface over many years.
This was an operating theater, underground, hidden from the world. On shelves constructed from rough lumber, Thomas had stored his reference materials, medical textbooks, anatomical atlases, journals of neurology and surgery. Some were legitimate medical texts from the 1840s and 1850s. Others were notebooks filled with Thomas's own observations and theories, written in his precise, controlled handwriting. Curtis opened one of the notebooks randomly. The prevailing theory suggests that personality is distributed throughout the cerebral cortex, but my observations suggest otherwise. I believe there are specific regions, particularly in the frontal areas, where the sense of self resides. By disrupting these regions with minimal collateral damage, one should theoretically be able to preserve motor function and basic cognition while eliminating the rebellious aspects of personality that make a subject difficult to control. This is not cruelty. This is science. The subjects feel no more pain than a patient undergoing necessary amputation, and the potential benefits to society, a method of rehabilitation for criminals, a treatment for dangerous insanity, were simply a means of making difficult individuals more compliant, are incalculable. Curtis felt sick reading it. The clinical language, the complete absence of empathy, the way Thomas referred to human beings as subjects while acknowledging that they would feel pain. It was the writing of someone who had convinced himself that horror was acceptable if it served a higher purpose. On the wall opposite the surgical table, Thomas had created what could only be described as a gallery of horrors. Anatomical drawings sketched in chalk and charcoal, drawings of human heads showing incision points, drawings of brains with regions labeled, and most disturbing, 7 different sketches labeled Subject 1 through Subject 7, each showing a human face with annotations noting behavioral changes, surgical outcomes, and dates. Subject 1, Samuel, deceased, 1855, excessive brain damage, learned from failure. Subject 2, Ruth, deceased, 1867, partial success, achieved compliance but at cost of higher function. Subject 3, Marcus, deceased, 1870, complete success, perfect outcome confirmed hypothesis. Subject 4, Rebecca, status unknown, shows unexpected recovery, concerning. Subject 5, Joshua, status unknown, retained too much cognitive function, error in technique. Subject 6, Denina, status unknown, strong-willed, multiple procedures required, ultimately unsuccessful in achieving full compliance. Subject 7, Benjamin, deceased, 1860, septic infection post-procedure, could not save subject. 7 people, 7 human beings who had been reduced to experimental subjects, 4 confirmed dead, 3 status unknown. And then Curtis noticed something else on the wall, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. More recent writing, added in a different hand. The letters were shaky, less precise than Thomas's controlled script, but the message was clear. We remember everything, every cut, every violation, every year in darkness. We remember, and soon you will answer for what you have done. And this had been written by one of the prisoners recently, judging from how fresh the chalk marks looked. "Sheriff?" Peter Griffith called from the first chamber, his voice still shaky. "There's another room back here, and Sheriff, you need to see this." The third chamber was accessed through a low opening at the back of the sleeping area. Curtis had to crouch to enter, and once inside, he could barely stand upright. The ceiling here was only about 6 feet high, and the space was narrow, extending back into darkness beyond the reach of his lantern. This was a burial chamber. 7 excavations in the floor, each roughly the size and shape of a human body. 4 of them contained remains in various stages of decomposition. 3 were empty, but freshly dug, with piles of dark earth beside them. On the wall beside each grave, someone had scratched a name and dates. Samuel, born unknown, died 1855. He resisted. Ruth, born unknown, died 1867. She never forgot who she was. Marcus, born unknown, died 1870. They broke him. We will not be broken. Benjamin, born unknown, died 1860. He was only 22 years old. And then 3 more markers, with graves prepared but empty. Rebecca, born unknown, will never die in darkness. Joshua, born unknown, will die free or not at all. Denina, born unknown, will see justice done. The 3 empty graves were dated October 1st, 1875, just 4 days earlier. They dug their own graves, Deputy Thompson said quietly, having joined Curtis and Griffith in the burial chamber. The 3 survivors, they prepared these graves and dated them, but then they didn't use them because they changed their minds, Curtis said slowly, realization dawning. They decided not to die. They decided to do something else instead. Griffith pointed to the corner of the chamber. "Sheriff, look, there's something else here." A hole in the wall, approximately 3 feet in diameter, partially concealed by loose earth and stones. Curtis brought his lantern close and peered into it. A tunnel, hand-dug, extending back into darkness, angling upward.
The walls showed finger marks in the clay, carved out over what must have been months or years of painstaking work. "They dug an escape route," Curtis said. "The 3 survivors, they tunneled out, but then where are they?" Griffith asked. "And where's the Harlow family?" Curtis didn't answer immediately. He was putting together a timeline, a sequence of events based on the evidence before him. 3 survivors, Rebecca, Joshua, and Danina, had spent years recovering from Thomas's procedures, regaining their memories and their sense of self. They'd removed their chains somehow, filed through metal with makeshift tools. They dug a tunnel to freedom, working in secret, probably at night when the family above was sleeping. And finally, they'd completed their tunnel. Freedom was within reach. They could have escaped, vanished into the night and never been found, but they hadn't. Instead, they dug 3 graves dated October 1st, planning to die, or perhaps planning for others to die. And then sometime around October 1st or 2nd, based on the state of the food in the kitchen, something had happened, something that changed everyone's plans. "The footprints," Curtis said. 8 sets of prints in the kitchen, 3 coming up from here, the survivors, 5 going down, the Harlow family. The question is, did the family go willingly or by force? Over the following days, Sheriff Curtis and a rotating team of deputies and volunteers conducted a thorough investigation of the property. What they found painted an increasingly disturbing picture. In Thomas's study on the 2nd floor, they discovered a locked drawer in his desk. Inside were documents that provided crucial context. Letters from D.B. in Baltimore discussing the purchase and transport of merchandise in carefully coded language. The letters confirmed that Thomas had acquired 7 enslaved people in 1854 with the explicit understanding that they would disappear from all official records. Financial records showing payments to various suppliers for medical equipment, surgical texts, and materials for the basement construction. Thomas had spent a small fortune over 20 years maintaining his underground laboratory. A journal written by Margaret Harlow hidden in a hat box in her bedroom. Unlike Thomas's clinical scientific notebooks, Margaret's journal was an account of psychological disintegration. July 1855.
Thomas has brought 7 people to the farm. He says they are part of an important medical study. He says they have agreed to participate, but I've heard them crying at night. I've heard them begging to be released. Thomas says I don't understand the necessity of the work. He says I lack scientific perspective, but I know wrong when I see it. God help me, I know wrong, and I'm doing nothing to stop it. December 1857. One of them died today. Thomas buried the body in the south field after dark. He wouldn't let me help, wouldn't let me see. He said it was better if I remained separate from the technical aspects of the project. I'm so tired. I'm so tired of pretending this is normal. But what can I do? If I report Thomas to the authorities, he'll be arrested, perhaps executed. Our children will be left fatherless, stigmatized. We'll lose everything. So I stay silent, and my silence makes me complicit. There is no redemption for me. I know this now. April 1863. The war has made everything worse. Thomas is afraid someone will discover the basement during his absence if he's conscripted. He's taken measures to ensure the people down there cannot escape, even if the house is searched. He's added more chains, reinforced the door. The sounds from below are constant now, crying, singing, sometimes screaming. I've stopped attending church. I can't bear to hear sermons about mercy and salvation when I know what we're doing, when I know that I'm allowing it to continue. October 1870. Marcus died last night. Thomas is devastated, not because a human being is dead, but because he's lost his successful subject. He keeps saying Marcus was proof that his theories were correct. I wanted to scream at him. Proof that you can break someone's mind through torture is not proof of scientific advancement. It's proof that you're a monster. But I didn't scream.
I never scream. I just nodded and went about preparing dinner as if a man hadn't just died in our basement after 15 years of imprisonment. February 1875. The remaining 3 are recovering. I don't know how, but they're becoming themselves again. I can hear them talking, real conversations, not the confused mumblings that Thomas's procedures induced. They remember who they were. They remember what was done to them. Thomas is frightened, though he won't admit it. He checks the basement locks multiple times each day. He started carrying a pistol. He knows what's coming. We all know what's coming. And I find myself thinking, we deserve it. Whatever they do to us, we deserve it. The final entry in Margaret's journal was dated September 30th, 1875. Catherine came to me today with a decision she's made. My daughter, my firstborn, who has lived her entire conscious life with this horror beneath her feet, has finally reached her breaking point. She's going to send a letter to the church, an anonymous letter, telling someone to investigate the basement. I should stop her. I should protect my family. But I can't. I'm done. 20 years of complicity have destroyed my soul. If Catherine wants to expose the truth, I won't prevent it. Maybe someone from outside needs to end this. Maybe that's the only way any of us, survivors and perpetrators alike, will ever find peace. I asked Catherine if she understood the consequences. She said, "Mama, I understand that some things are worse than consequences. Living with this knowledge is worse than any punishment the law could give us." She's 17 years old, and she's wiser than I've ever been. This confirmed what Curtis had suspected. Catherine Harlow had written the anonymous letter that brought Reverend Walsh to the farm. The eldest child, unable to bear her family's guilt any longer, had called for outside intervention. But by the time that intervention arrived, the situation had already reached its terrible conclusion. A week into the investigation, Curtis decided to explore the tunnel. Peter Griffith volunteered to go, being the smallest of the men. They tied a rope around his waist, both for safety and so they could pull him back if needed, and gave him a small lantern. Then he crawled into the narrow opening in the basement wall and began working his way through the passage. Griffith later described the experience. "It was barely wide enough for me to fit, and I'm not a large man. I had to pull myself forward with my elbows, pushing the lantern ahead of me. The walls were rough clay, gouged with marks from whoever had dug it, finger marks mostly. I kept thinking about how long this must have taken. Months, maybe years, clawing through clay with nothing but their hands and whatever makeshift tools they could create. The tunnel sloped upward at about a 15-degree angle. Whoever dug it understood basic engineering. They kept the grade consistent to prevent collapse, and they'd shored up weak sections with bits of wood, probably scavenged from the sleeping pallets. I crawled for what felt like forever, but was probably about 15 minutes. The tunnel made several turns, deliberately, I think, to avoid obstacles like tree roots, and then suddenly it opened. I came out under a rotted tree stump about half a mile from the farmhouse, deep in the woods on the eastern edge of the property. I stood up, brushed myself off, and looked around. The opening was perfectly concealed. You'd never find it unless you knew exactly where to look. And here's the strange thing, Sheriff. The ground around the tunnel exit was completely undisturbed. The autumn leaves were thick, covering everything, and they hadn't been walked on recently. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had come through here. But someone had. 3 people had escaped through that tunnel. The question was, when and where did they go after that? Curtis brought a surveyor to examine the tunnel more carefully. The surveyor confirmed that it extended approximately 37 feet from the basement to the woods, that it showed signs of sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics, and that it had taken an enormous amount of work to create.
Whoever dug this, the surveyor said, was incredibly determined and patient. You can't rush work like this. If you dig too fast, the tunnel collapses. You have to go slowly, carefully, shoring up each section before proceeding. I'd estimate this took at least a year of consistent work, maybe 2 years. Could 3 people do it? Curtis asked. 3 people working in shifts, taking turns digging while the others rested or kept watch? Yes, possible. They'd have to be quiet. Any loud noise would alert people above, and they'd have to dispose of the excavated soil somehow, probably spreading it around the basement floor in thin layers so it wouldn't be noticed. Curtis thought about this. For 1 or 2 years, the 3 survivors had been digging their way to freedom, carefully, quietly, maintaining their secret, even as Thomas Harlow became increasingly aware that they'd regained their cognitive function. It was an astounding feat of planning and endurance, but it left the central question unanswered. Why did they tunnel to freedom, but not use the tunnel to escape? Why did the footprints in the kitchen show them coming up into the house? And most importantly, where were they now? Where was the Harlow family? The investigation expanded to include interviews with neighbors, merchants, church members, anyone who'd had contact with the Harlow family over the previous 20 years. Patricia Downing gave her testimony by letter from Richmond, describing her 1858 visit and her sister's request to investigate if anything happened to the family. Samuel and Emma Porter were interviewed extensively. Emma's diary entries were examined and became part of the official record. William Gardner, the store merchant, provided his sales ledgers showing the pattern of purchases that suggested Thomas was provisioning more people than his immediate family. Miss Constance Winters, the traveling teacher, was tracked down and interviewed about her interaction with James and Robert Harlow in 1869. A clearer picture emerged. The Harlow family had been living with their terrible secret for 20 years, isolated and increasingly unstable. Margaret was psychologically shattered.
Catherine felt crushing guilt. The younger boys, James and Robert, had grown up accepting the horror as normal, but showing signs of deep psychological damage. And Thomas himself had transitioned from confident scientific experimental to frightened man who knew his control was slipping. The investigation also turned up one particularly disturbing fact. Thomas Harlow had never been qualified to perform any medical procedures. His service during the Mexican-American War had been as a clerk and assistant, not as a physician. He had no medical training, no surgical experience, no credentials whatsoever. Everything he'd done in that basement, the procedures, the experiments, the operations, had been performed by an amateur who'd learned from textbooks and trial and error on human subjects who couldn't refuse. The 4 people buried in that basement hadn't just been imprisoned, they'd been tortured to death by a man playing at being a doctor. On October 21st, Sheriff Curtis assembled everyone involved in the investigation, deputies, the reverend, the state investigator, and several trusted community members, and presented his theory of what had happened. Based on the evidence, I believe the sequence of events was as follows. For 20 years, Thomas Harlow imprisoned 7 people in his basement and conducted experimental medical procedures on them. 4 died as a result of these procedures. 3 survived: Rebecca, Joshua, and Denina. Over time, these 3 survivors regained cognitive function that Thomas's surgeries had damaged. They remembered who they were and what had been done to them. Approximately 2 years ago, they began digging a tunnel to escape. They completed that tunnel in late September 1875. Freedom was within reach, but they faced a choice: escape and live as fugitives, always looking over their shoulders, knowing Thomas might reveal their existence and have them hunted down as escaped prisoners or worse, or stay and ensure Thomas could never hurt anyone again. They chose the latter.
On September 30th or October 1st, Catherine Harlow, the eldest daughter, sent an anonymous letter to Reverend Walsh, begging someone to investigate the basement. She could no longer bear her family's complicity. On October 1st, the Harlow family sat down to dinner, knowing that Catherine's letter would soon bring authorities to their door. They ate together one last time. After dinner, or perhaps during it, the 3 survivors emerged from the basement. They'd removed the board sealing the door from the inside, using tools Thomas had carelessly left in the basement. They confronted the family. I don't know exactly what was said, but based on the footprint evidence, I believe this. The 3 survivors gave the Harlows a choice. Come with us into the basement, face what you've created, or wait here for the authorities and explain everything. Thomas, Margaret, Catherine, James, and Robert chose to go down. Perhaps they felt they had no other choice. Perhaps they believed facing the survivors' justice was preferable to facing the law. Perhaps they simply gave up, exhausted after 20 years of living with horror. They went down into the basement, and then Curtis paused. This was the part where evidence ended and speculation began. And then they went into the tunnel, all 8 people, but the tunnel was never meant as an escape route for 8. It was barely wide enough for 1 person at a time. Somewhere in that tunnel, something happened. The survivors enacted their justice, and the Harlow family disappeared. The 3 survivors emerged from the tunnel exit in the woods. They scattered. They vanished into the countryside, probably splitting up immediately. By the time we discovered the basement 5 days later, they could have been anywhere. There was a long silence when Curtis finished. Finally, the state investigator spoke. Sheriff, with respect, you're suggesting that 3 former enslaved people somehow abducted an entire family and made them disappear without a trace. That seems impossible, Curtis replied. I know, but I've examined all the evidence. I've crawled through that tunnel myself, and I'm telling you, 5 people went down, but they never came up. The tunnel doesn't go anywhere except that one exit in the woods. There are no side passages, no hidden chambers beyond what we've already found. The 3 survivors came out. The Harlow family didn't. Those are the facts. Then where are the bodies? I don't know, Curtis admitted, but I have a theory about that too. When Peter Griffith crawled through the tunnel, he only went as far as the exit in the woods. But what if the tunnel doesn't actually end there? What if it continues, hidden somehow, going deeper into the earth? Why would they dig past the exit point? To create a burial place, a place where certain bodies could be hidden, where they'd never be found, a place of final justice. Curtis could see skepticism on the faces around him. It did sound far-fetched, but he'd been in that basement. He'd seen what Thomas Harlow had done, and he understood something that many of the others didn't. When people are pushed far enough, when they endure years of unimaginable horror, they become capable of extraordinary things, things that seem impossible to those who haven't suffered as they have. 3 people who'd survived 20 years of imprisonment and torture, who'd dug a tunnel through solid earth with their bare hands, who'd rebuilt their shattered minds through sheer force of will. Those 3 people were capable of anything, including making an entire family disappear without a trace. On October 25th, the state investigator made a decision. The case would be sealed. The implications of this case are too explosive, he explained to Sheriff Curtis. If the full truth comes out that a Virginia landowner spent 20 years conducting medical experiments on enslaved people, even after emancipation, with his family's knowledge, it will inflame tensions that are barely under control as it is. The war has been over for only 10 years. The wounds are still fresh. This story could spark violence across multiple counties. Curtis wanted to argue, wanted to insist that truth mattered, that the 7 victims deserved to have their stories told. But he also understood the investigators' concern. Virginia in 1875 was a powder keg. The truth about the Harlow farm could indeed spark fires that would be hard to contain. The official report would state only that the Harlow family had relocated due to financial difficulties. The 7 bodies found buried on the property would be described as unknown victims of wartime violence and reinterred in unmarked graves in the Millbrook Cemetery. The basement would be filled in with earth. The house would be seized for unpaid taxes and sold at auction. The truth would be buried as completely as the victims. But Curtis made sure that detailed records were kept. Full documentation of everything found in the basement, complete transcripts of all interviews, copies of Thomas's journals and Margaret's diary, all of it sealed in the county archives with the notation not to be opened for 50 years. He did this because he believed that someday, when enough time had passed, people should know what happened, should know the names: Samuel, Ruth, Marcus, Rebecca, Joshua, Denina, Benjamin, should know they existed, should know they suffered, should know they survived, and should know that in the end they had the last word. The Harlow farmhouse stood empty for 3 years after the disappearance. The county tried to sell it, but prospective buyers kept backing out. Some claimed the price was too high. Others admitted they'd heard disturbing rumors about the property's history. The few who did move in never stayed long. In the spring of 1876, a family named Richardson purchased the property at auction. They were from Pennsylvania, knew nothing of the Harlow case, and saw nothing more than an opportunity to acquire good farmland at a bargain price. They lasted exactly 23 days. Mrs. Richardson later told her sister, "We heard sounds every night, singing from somewhere below the house, and voices, multiple voices, speaking in turn like they were having a conversation. My husband went down to the basement to investigate. He came back up white as a sheet and wouldn't speak for an hour. When he finally told me what he'd found, we packed our belongings that same day." The basement had been filled in with earth, according to the county records, but when my husband went down, he found that the earth had been disturbed, excavated, and there was a hole in the corner, a tunnel entrance, freshly dug from the inside out, as if something that had been buried was trying to come back up. We left that afternoon and never returned. Let someone else deal with whatever lives in that basement. 3 more families attempted to live in the house between 18...
Phenomena. Sounds at night, disturbances in the basement, a pervasive sense of wrongness that made it impossible to sleep. By 1879, the house stood abandoned. No one would buy it at any price. Vandals broke windows and stole whatever fixtures remained. The roof began to leak. In 1881, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the interior. Only the shell remained, blackened walls and a crumbling foundation. In 1894, a powerful storm system moved through the region. High winds and flooding damaged structures throughout the county. The Harlow farmhouse, already weakened by years of neglect, simply collapsed. The walls fell inward, burying the basement entrance under tons of rubble. The land reverted to the state and was eventually incorporated into the Jefferson National Forest. Today, the location where the Harlow house once stood is deep in protected wilderness. Few people ever visit the area. Those who do occasionally report an odd, barren patch of ground where nothing will grow, not even weeds. Forest rangers have noted this peculiarity. Soil tests show no contamination, no obvious reason for the barrenness. Trees surround the clearing but won't enter it, as if respecting some invisible boundary.
and rangers have reported something else. On still nights in early October, when the weather is calm and the forest is quiet, you can sometimes hear singing coming from the clearing. Multiple voices harmonizing in old spirituals that haven't been sung in more than a century. The rangers joke about it. They call it acoustic tricks and wind through the trees and wishful thinking from people who know the local legends. But they don't camp in that clearing, and they don't investigate the sounds too closely, because deep down they know what everyone who spent time in that forest knows. Some ground is haunted, not by supernatural forces, but by memories, by suffering so profound that it leaves scars on the earth itself, by the ghosts of justice delayed but not denied. 48 years after the Harlow family's disappearance, the letter arrived at the Millbrook Methodist Church. It was addressed to whoever now serves as Reverend, postmarked from Philadelphia, written in a shaking hand on cheap paper. Reverend Lucas Brennan, who'd taken up the position only 2 years earlier and knew nothing of the church's history with the Harlow case, opened it with curiosity. By the 3rd paragraph, he was reading with dawning horror. The letter was signed only R, presumably Rebecca, the youngest female survivor. It read in full, "To the Reverend, I am old now, 77 years, if my calculations of my birth date are correct, though I can never be certain. My memory of childhood is fragmented, partially from the passage of time and partially from what was done to me later. I am writing this because I want someone to know the truth before I die, not for absolution, I'm long past caring about such things, but for the record, so that someone, somewhere, bears witness to what happened. My name is Rebecca. That's the name I was given as a child, though it might not be the name I was born with. Memory is a complicated thing when someone has deliberately tried to destroy it. In 1854, I was 19 years old. I was sold to a man who promised to make me and 6 others disappear, and he did. For 20 years, we disappeared from the world. I won't describe in detail what Thomas Harlow did to us in his basement. Some acts of horror lose their power if you speak them aloud. They become almost manageable, reduced to mere words. I want you to understand that what happened was beyond words, beyond ordinary human cruelty. He didn't just imprison us, he tried to erase us from the inside out, to remake our minds through surgery and pain until we forgot we'd ever been human. He succeeded with some. Samuel died quickly, brain damaged beyond recovery. Benjamin died of infection after his procedure. Ruth lived 12 years, but never truly recovered herself. Marcus became exactly what Thomas wanted, compliant, empty, a shell. But 3 of us survived, Joshua, Dina, and myself. And over time, years and years, we found our way back. The brain is more resilient than Thomas understood. It builds new pathways around damaged ones. It reconstructs itself. Slowly, painfully, we remembered who we'd been. And when we remembered, we knew we had to do something. We couldn't simply escape. Thomas would have reported us as fugitives, as escaped prisoners, as property. We'd have been hunted. We'd never be free. So we planned something else. We dug a tunnel. For 2 years we took turns digging, using sharpened spoons, broken pieces of wood, our own hands. We dug for freedom, but we also dug for justice. On October 1st, 1875, we completed our work. That evening, we removed the board sealing the basement door. We'd filed through our chains months earlier, so nothing restrained us. We could have escaped at any time, but we waited. We waited until everything was ready. We went upstairs and confronted the family. Margaret was terrified, but unsurprised. She'd known this was coming. The children were confused, having grown up with our imprisonment as their normal. Thomas was resigned. 20 years of guilt had hollowed him out. He knew he deserved whatever we planned. We gave them a choice. Come with us into the basement and see what you've created. Face the place where 7 people lived and 4 died because of you. Or stay here and wait for the authorities, because someone has already reported you. Catherine, the daughter, only 17, had sent a letter to your church warning that someone should look in the basement. She told us this herself, crying, begging us to let her family go, saying she'd tried to expose the truth. We believed her, but belief doesn't erase 20 years. Sorrow doesn't restore the dead. Good intentions don't undo evil. They came down with us, all 5 of them, into the basement where we lived like animals, into the burial chamber where our friends lay in unmarked graves, into the tunnel we dug with our hands. The tunnel was only 3 feet wide, barely large enough for 1 person. We went first, crawling, pulling them behind us. They came willingly, or perhaps they were simply too shocked to resist. But the tunnel didn't end where the sheriff later thought it did. That opening in the woods was a decoy. We'd created it to mislead anyone who might search. The real tunnel continued past that point, hidden by a carefully constructed false wall. It angled deeper into the earth, going down rather than up. We'd spent 6 months digging that second section, creating a chamber at the end of it, a chamber large enough for 5 people. That's where we left them, deep in the earth, in the darkness where we'd lived for 20 years. We left them with a single lantern and 2 days' worth of water. We told them the tunnel exit was behind them. They'd have to crawl back the way they came to escape. But there was no exit. The false wall we'd constructed was solid. They'd never find it in the darkness, never realize the way they'd come in was blocked from the inside. They'd search and call for help, and eventually accept that no help was coming. They'd live for perhaps a week with the water we'd left them, maybe longer depending on how carefully they rationed it, and then they'd die in the darkness, as Ruth had died, as Samuel had died, as Benjamin and Marcus and the others had died, in darkness, alone, forgotten by the world. Is this evil? I don't know. I've spent 48 years thinking about it. I married a good man who never knew my past. I had children. I lived a life. And through all of it, I've wondered, did I do something unforgivable, or did I do the only thing that made sense? I believe we did what had to be done. The law wouldn't have helped us. Authorities then didn't care about people like us. We'd have been dismissed, disbelieved, or worse, blamed for our own imprisonment. So we created our own justice. The others, Joshua and Dina, split off from me in Richmond. I never saw them again. We agreed never to contact each other, never to risk leading investigators back to what we'd done. I hope they found peace. I hope they built lives. As for me, I'm dying now. Cancer, the doctor says. I have perhaps 2 months. So I'm telling this story because someone should know. Not because I want forgiveness, I don't believe in it anymore, but because 7 people existed. Samuel, Ruth, Marcus, Benjamin, Joshua, Dina, and Rebecca. We were real, we lived, we suffered, we survived, and we ensured that our suffering ended. Do with this knowledge what you will. I'll be dead soon. I'm not afraid of earthly judgment. I faced the worst humanity has to offer and survived it. Whatever comes after death can't be worse than what came before. Remember us. Reverend Brennan.
The letter would be added to the sealed case file, but no active investigation would be pursued. These events occurred during a terrible time in our nation's history, the head archivist said. If Rebecca's letter is true, it represents justice by people who had no other avenue for justice. Pursuing it now serves no purpose except to reopen wounds that should be left to heal. Brennan agreed. The letter was filed away. The case remained sealed. But the archivist, a woman named Dorothy Hastings, was troubled by Rebecca's claim about the tunnel. If the letter was true, there was a hidden chamber somewhere beneath the former Harlow property containing the remains of 5 people. In November 1923, she organized a small expedition to the site. She brought a surveyor, 2 experienced miners, and a doctor who specialized in forensic examination. They located the collapsed ruins of the farmhouse, now little more than a depression in the forest floor, covered with 48 years of growth. Using old property maps and the descriptions from the 1875 investigation, they identified where the tunnel exit in the woods should have been. They found the old tree stump, now completely rotted away, and began excavation. They found the tunnel entrance within an hour of digging. Time had partially collapsed some sections, but the main passage was still intact, shored up by the wooden beams the survivors had installed decades earlier. The surveyor rigged up a cable system with a camera attachment, new technology that allowed them to examine the tunnel without crawling through it. They sent the camera down, following the passage from the woods back toward where the farmhouse had been, and they found the false wall, exactly where Rebecca had described it. It took 2 days of careful excavation to break through the wall without collapsing the entire tunnel. The miners worked slowly, aware that they were potentially disturbing a crime scene or a grave. On the 3rd day, they broke through into the hidden chamber. Dorothy Hastings reviewed the photographs taken by the camera. She looked at them once, then set them down carefully and walked away to be sick. In the chamber, roughly 8 feet square, dug from solid clay, were 5 skeletons. 2 adults, likely male based on bone structure, 2 young adults, 1 male, 1 female, and 1 child. They were arranged in a circle, holding hands. Even in death, even in darkness, they'd clung to each other. Beside the skeletons was a burned-out lantern, 2 clay jugs that had once held water, and something else. Writing scratched into the wall in multiple hands, growing increasingly shaky and desperate. Day 1. We came down here thinking we'd find our way back. The way is blocked. We're trapped. Day 3. Water is running low. Thomas tried to dig through the wall, but the earth just collapses. We're going to die down here. Day 5. Robert is crying. I can't comfort him. We're all going to die because of what I did. God forgive me. Thomas. Day 6. I should have exposed him years ago. I was a coward. I sacrificed 7 innocent people for my family's comfort, and now we're paying the price. This is justice. Horrible justice, but justice nonetheless. Margaret, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I tried to help. I sent the letter, but it was too late. Too late for them. Too late for us. If anyone finds this, we deserved this. Catherine. Mama, I'm scared. Robert. The writing stopped after what appeared to be about 7 or 8 days. After that, there were only scratches on the walls, fingernails clawing at earth, desperate attempts to dig out. They died in darkness, slowly, exactly as Rebecca had planned. Dorothy Hastings made a decision. She photographed everything, documented it thoroughly, and then gave orders to seal the chamber permanently. Concrete, she instructed the workers. Fill the entire tunnel with concrete. Make sure no one can ever access this chamber again. But ma'am, these are human remains. Don't they deserve a proper burial? Hastings looked at the young man who'd asked the question. Do you know what happened here? Do you know what those 5 people did to 7 innocent individuals? No, ma'am, I don't know the full story. Then trust me when I say this is their grave. They chose it when they chose to commit atrocity. They died here because they deserved to die here. Leave them. The workers filled the tunnel with concrete. They covered the entrance with earth and stones. They planted fast-growing trees over the site to conceal any signs of excavation. Within a year, the forest had reclaimed the area completely. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you'd never know the tunnel had been opened, investigated, and sealed forever.
The Harlow case remained sealed until 1925, when the 50-year restriction expired. But by then, everyone directly involved was dead. The survivors, Rebecca, Joshua, and Dinah, were gone. The neighbors who'd heard sounds at night were gone.
The deputies who'd investigated were gone. The case was briefly noted in a regional history journal as an interesting mystery from Virginia's troubled post-war period. But without living witnesses and with the most damning evidence sealed in concrete 60 feet underground, it remained just a curious historical footnote. Over the decades, the story faded into obscurity. The location of the farmhouse was forgotten by all but a few local historians. The names of the 7 victims were lost, known only to those who read the sealed files. But in the forest, in that barren clearing where nothing will grow, something persists. Hikers occasionally camp in the Jefferson National Forest. Most avoid the clearing. It just feels wrong, they say, though they can't explain why. The few who do camp there report disturbed sleep, strange dreams, and the sense of being watched. And on certain nights, usually in early October, around the anniversary of the family's disappearance, people report hearing sounds, singing, multiple voices in harmony rising from somewhere beneath the ground. Old spirituals, songs of suffering and survival, of endurance and freedom, of justice long delayed but finally achieved. The Forest Service has investigated these reports multiple times. They've sent rangers to the clearing, set up recording equipment, monitored the area. They've never captured the singing on tape. It only seems to occur when people are present to hear it, and only some people at that. Others hear nothing but wind and forest sounds. Is it real? Is it psychological? Is it some atmospheric phenomenon that creates auditory illusions? Or is it something else, something that exists at the boundary between memory and reality, between history and haunting? The rangers don't debate it anymore. They simply note in their reports acoustic anomalies reported in grid section F17, origin unknown. Recommend visitors be diverted to other camping areas. Because whether the sounds are real or imagined, they serve as a reminder of what happened there, a reminder that some acts of horror leave permanent scars, that some suffering is too profound to ever fully erase, that 7 people existed, that they were imprisoned, tortured, killed, or broken, that 3 survived and took terrible justice into their own hands, and that 5 people who enabled and perpetrated those horrors paid the ultimate price. All of it is true, or none of it is true, or the truth exists somewhere in the space between documented fact and folk legend. The only certain thing is this: if you go to that clearing in the Jefferson National Forest, if you stand in that barren circle where nothing grows, you feel something, a weight in the air, a sense of presence, a whisper of sounds that might be wind or might be voices. And if you listen very carefully, if you still your own breathing and silence your own thoughts, you might hear them, 7 voices singing about suffering, about survival, about the long road from bondage to freedom, from victimhood to agency, from powerlessness to power, about the family that opened a door they'd kept sealed for 20 years and discovered that the people on the other side had not forgotten, had not forgiven, and had been waiting patiently for the moment that justice could finally be served. About the night when prisoners became judges, when victims became avengers, when the buried past burst up into the present and demanded its due. Some doors should remain closed. Some basements should never be explored. Some truths, once revealed, cannot be contained. The Harlow family learned this in their final days in darkness and terror, in a chamber beneath the earth where 7 people had suffered, and 3 had survived, and 5 would die. They learned it too late, but they learned. And now their story, carefully preserved, sealed for 50 years, investigated and documented and buried again, serves as a warning
a warning that horror has consequences, that complicity has costs, that silence in the face of atrocity is its own form of evil, that justice, when denied too long, finds its own terrible ways of manifesting. The singing continues. The clearing remains barren. The tunnel is sealed forever in concrete and earth. And somewhere in the spaces between what's documented and what's whispered, between what's proven and what's suspected, the truth waits. The truth about the family that disappeared after opening the basement door. The truth about the 7 people who lived and died in darkness. The truth about the 3 who survived and the justice they carved from their suffering. Listen carefully. The forest remembers. The earth remembers. And on still October nights, when the conditions are just right, you can hear them remembering too. 7 voices singing. They're singing about freedom. They're singing about survival. They're singing about the day when the door finally opened and the reckoning they'd waited 20 years for finally came. They're singing, and they'll never